Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. How are American listeners? How are you enjoying the nascent fascist state? I mean, look, it was oligarchic already. I'm not pretending like it was there was a Princeton study done in 2012, I believe, sometime in the early 20-teens. That was like the decisions that Congress makes, or that the government in general makes, are now completely separated from the wishes of their constituents. So I didn't have any illusions about the country that I lived in, but this is going to be a whole new roller coaster. And this roller coaster is going to be run by RFK Jr. and Matt Gaetz. I really love, if you have not been paying attention, bird flu, avian flu, H5N1 is poised to turn into a real pandemic. And we're going to have RFK Jr. as the head of Health and Human Services when that happens. So, I don't know. I guess have fun. Have fun now. And guess what? One of those ways you can have fun is by listening to today's episode. This was really a joy. This is Jake Xerxes Fussell, and if you don't know who he is, I'm going to read you his bio right now. Originally from Columbus, Georgia, a musician, Jake Xerxes Fussell is the son of folklorist Fred Fussell, and as a teenager began playing and studying with elder musicians in the Chattahoochee Valley, apprenticing with Piedmont blues legend Precious Bryant, with whom he toured and recorded. In 2015, Jake released his debut self-titled album composed entirely of adapted folk and blues songs on Paradise and Bachelors, his home for his next 3 albums, What in the Natural World, Out of Sight, and Good and Green Again. Earlier this summer, Fat Possum Records released his latest album, When I'm Called, and listeners, it's a delight. And guess who else is a delight? Jake himself. This was taped before the election, well before. I think maybe a month. Maybe 5 weeks, I don't know. So we talk about the what was happening in a more relaxed way than perhaps we would have if we had conducted this interview today. But Jake plays traditional American music, or he plays his own music too that comes out of that tradition. And we talk a lot about that and a lot about America. That's why America is on my mind when I first started the interview with him. And Jake has some very thoughtful answers, and I appreciated talking to him. I hope you like this. Coming up on the show, Fred Thomas, Brian Adams and Infinity Knives, one of my favorite hip-hop duos around. Jason Aaron, one of the best comics writers in the game, also from the South. So stay tuned for those episodes, but for now, let's talk to Jake. I was thinking about this, but just because comedy is so adjacent to right-wing, there's like so many right-wing comedians now,
yeah,
that it kind of is smuggled in because there are these places like the Comedy Store, you know, the stand-up. By the way, this is besides my wife, this is like the first conversation I've had today. So I was about to say stand-up area. It is a club.
Right.
It's a club in West Hollywood. And you've got like people like Mark Maron, who are, you know, liberal, left kind of people. And then you also have, you know, right-wing comedians there, and they get to like hang out together. So it makes it look like the right-wing stuff is palatable. And then you listen to, or you see transcripts of the right-wing people on their podcasts, and they're just like, you know what, Alex Jones is right. And you're like, oh no.
Yeah, I guess a lot of that is under the tradition of like, or under the guise of free speech, I guess. And to some degree it is, but it's like, sure. When that stuff starts taking over, it's like, how much of this is free speech and how much of this is just like us being bombarded with the same old shit, or both at the same time, you know?
Yeah, I think it is both because like I was up until maybe this year, I was a free speech absolutist, and I was just like,
Mm-hmm.
that's you need that, and then I'm like, well, what is the cutoff in a country like ours? And this is I will use this to get into us talking about other
Sure,
things
yeah,
because, but like in a country like ours where it is pretty like since maybe Citizens United or maybe since the 1970s or whatever, you know, it's pretty much an oligarchy at this point.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know, what is actual free speech that should be protected, and what is just propaganda that is used to manipulate us? And is that protected? I don't know.
Right. Well, there's that too. And there's also like this pretense that cancel culture is not, that's like the opposite of free speech, or when it's actually just like people reacting to heinous shit. It's like, oh, you can still say whatever the hell you want, but people are going to react. And so I don't know. It's a complicated and nuanced subject, but
For both of us,
so much of
we're both
so much of the people like shirking or recoiling from so-called cancel culture is like, oh, you just don't like people reacting negatively to what the racist shit that you're saying.
yeah,
you know.
yeah.
That's part of free speech is that you can say all that stuff, but people are going to react.
Yeah.
But it is weird how so much of like internet culture has given rise to a lot of that stuff in a way that like I don't know, it's good and bad the way that like certain media outlets have lost their power, that everybody's sort of like a transmitter to some degree, and that people have access to like dissemination. I don't know. It's weird that like there's such an immensity of mediation.
Mm-hmm. It's still, I think, pretty much. I don't know if you ever read Manufacturing Consent, but like I
haven't.
It's great. The propaganda model that Chomsky and Herman lay out, I think, is still pretty accurate in terms of like when you read a corporate news source, you're not getting one opinion, but you're getting many opinions of the people who are the wealthiest in the country. So they're not all aligned. They have differing opinions, and you see that filtered through the media sources when they are, like Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post.
Mm-hmm.
Like they may not do it. They're not going to on purpose. They're not going to on purpose kill a story that might be unfavorable to Amazon, but they just won't pursue it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's that kind of stuff. Or they won't, I mean, maybe it's a little crazier now, but at least when they were coming up with the propaganda model, that was the basic assumption. And it seems correct.
Right. And you have the illusion of a number of different perspectives, and they might be mildly different, but you're not. Yeah. Yeah. How'd we get on this subject?
It started before we started recording. I think what interests me, though, not necessarily talking about this stuff. I mean, it does, but the kind of music you make is deeply connected with America, and in all its kind of good and bad facets. Like when I listen to your music, the good parts of America stand out to me, and it was interesting. This is maybe a side note, but when I was reading an interview with you last night, just talking about the kind of music that you make, and I started having this kind of what I was trying to I've called it temporal panic or temporal anxiety. Like I could feel the history of America as I was reading it, or in a way that like I don't think I get it when you play music, it just feels I'm present. But like just reading about you talking about it made me feel the history of America. And I'm like, have you ever felt that? Does that make any sense? The thing I just said?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I guess I feel it all the time, to some degree or another, but not by choice. It's something that we're just enveloped by. If you have any interest in the past, you know, I think that's getting at some of what you're feeling, maybe. Sometimes it
Yeah.
is a panicky feeling, and other times it's not. Just depends on what aspects I'm thinking about.
It was almost like a time lapse of America went through my head, and feeling feeling history in such a way that that it like made me anxious about. Oh, there's like I in my normal day I don't think about hundreds of years going past. I don't think about the world before I was born and the world after I will die. But knowing that it's this thing and I'm just here for this small amount, I think that's the temporal panic I'm talking about.
Oh yeah. Well, I think about that all the time, and that's kind of where I live, but it's not necessarily anxiety inducing for me. And I don't know why that is, but it's just part of, I see like making music as part of a continuum of just my time here on Earth. And I'm just sort of tapping into my time and place
Mm,
in my little realm of creativity, if that makes any sense.
yeah. Do you think you are a grounded person?
To some degree, yes. I mean, I had a very happy childhood. I don't suffer from any like major traumas that I'm aware of. So I'm grounded to that degree. I consider myself pretty happy. I'm surrounded by loving family and all that kind of stuff. So I have a lot working in my favor as far as that goes. And I feel very fortunate, privileged. But at the same time, like anybody else in this world, especially now having a kid, you look around and it's an anxious and very troubled society,
Uh-huh.
and I travel a lot, and there's a lot of problems that are very apparent before our, like just playing out before our eyes, not even taking into account like all the mediation of all that, just the news, but just like everything. So yeah, there's a lot to worry about, but at the same time, I have a lot to be thankful for, and I have a lot of the main thing I think about is that I had a lot of modeled behavior for me when I was growing up that was admirable and noble and all that. So I sort of strive to, model that for my kid now, and if I
Yeah.
can, and my partner is good at that as well. So anyway, this is, there's a lot to pick apart there, but yeah, I think I'm generally pretty grounded. I think, but that, I think it's a relative thing. I think everybody deals with issues as they go through life, and touring. I travel so much that presents its own sort of set of challenges, and also kind of becomes like a weird. Sometimes you feel like you're in a weird time warp or something when you're traveling so much. So I talk to other musicians, and they all relate to that, or other people who travel for work a lot, and it's just kind of like you wind up sort of being stressed a lot of the time about a bunch of little things, and then you kind of wonder what it's all about.
Yeah.
It's such a different thing from like creating music. Touring and playing music is such a different process than actually making music. And then making records is a totally different thing from that. So you want to like sort of becoming known for doing these things that you actually didn't set out to do.
Yeah.
Like making records is a completely scientific process that has very little to do with playing music. And touring is this like kind of grueling thing where there's moments of real magic and fun, and playing shows it's sort of its own thing. Although playing shows, as it turns out, is kind of a small part of touring. I mean, it's a major part, but it's just one small part of the day that you're constantly like getting ready for or recovering from. So anyway, it winds up being this weird thing where you're sort of dealing with a lot of different aspects that have very little to do with making music. And that becomes
Yeah.
what the job is of being. I'm saying this as somebody who has only recently, in the past, let's say 5 years, become like music has been my only source of income. And so, it's been like a lot of that has been something I've been learning. But then talking to older people who've been doing this for a long time, or people who are younger than me who have been doing it longer, and everybody kind of has this. We all meet up at festivals and we kind of talk about it. And everybody's like, "How are you doing?" I'm like, "I'm okay."
Yeah, it is interesting. Like when you start doing something creative, you're just doing it because you want to do that thing, whatever it is, playing guitar or, making videos with your friends or something like that. And then once it becomes professionalized, suddenly all these things that you didn't necessarily build skills in become part of the job. Like in writing, you learn to be a writer. In TV writing, you learn to be a writer and you learn to get good at narrative or dialogue or jokes or whatever it is, right? And then if you get lucky, you create a show and you become the showrunner. And now you're not a writer necessarily, you're a manager and you're running basically a small business. Like a network gives you millions of dollars and now you're the person in charge of making sure this business happens.
Yeah, I mean, it is funny. Like, I think it's particularly weird with musicians like now. I mean, I don't know. I talk to people who have been around it, the music industry and stuff. Like, I kind of got into it when streaming and all that had already taken over. Like my first record came out not even 10 years ago. So, almost 10 years ago. But like, I didn't come into it with the expectation that I was going to make like tons of money off of royalties, because that's not really happening by the time I made a record. That ship had sailed. But then I know other people who have been in it a long time and they're like, well, hey, wait a minute. Where did sales go? That kind of thing. So the model changed so dramatically. But I do think even in the past couple of years that I've been in it, there's a lot of expectation on artists to do certain things, and if you don't play the game, it's kind of like, hey, why are you not doing this? And I'm fortunate to be surrounded by a team of people who are actually quite supportive and understand my individual stance on this and are empathetic. I'm not saying that like my management or label is pressuring to me to do things that I don't want to do, but there is kind of a general expectation to create content endlessly.
Yes.
And it's just such an internet trick, and I think people are tiring of it. I mean, I don't know. I have a lot of opinions about that, but it's a strange thing where it winds up being this like weird, murky world of self-promotion that is and advertising that's sort of disguised as creativity. And I don't believe in it personally, but I'd have to participate in it to a small degree to make a living.
I mean, when you started to, well, let me go back even further. When you were thinking of even wanting to do this professionally, and streaming had already become kind of the go-to way that this is done, in a way that it privileges Spotify or privileges whoever and definitely exploits the artist. And I don't know if you knew that at the time or not, but was there any expectation that this would be something you could actually do full time, or was it just this means something to me deep in my heart, and so regardless of whatever else I have to do, I'm going to do this anyway? Like, what were you thinking at that time, or anything?
Yeah.
Or were you just going, or just moving forward?
I was kind of just going, but at the same time, it was always an eventual thing in the back of my mind that I wanted to do this for a living. Now, I knew music was always my main interest, and I wasn't much good at doing anything else. And I mean, anywhere I've been employed, I was kind of a half-assed employee, And but I've enjoyed certain jobs. I worked in a lot of record stores and bookstores and did that kind of stuff for years. And I had other jobs, I worked for a survey company for a while, and that was pretty fun. I worked in insurance for a little bit.
Survey like land survey or survey like giving people surveys?
Get more like, yeah, statistician type stuff. It was actually like traffic surveys. I worked for this company in Mississippi when I lived there for a number of years. But yeah, I was always like thinking, and throughout all those jobs, I was making money playing music. Like cash usually, or I played bass and I would like hop in the van for a tour with a band, and I did some of that, and I was a side man and always pursuing my own path with my own music. But was not all that public about it because I wanted to be careful in the way that I pursued that. So I think there was kind of more of a long-term plan than I realized, actually, now that I think back on it, because I didn't really like release a record until I knew I was kind of ready to do it and working with the right people.
I mean, the fact that you say like working with the right people, the fact that you have the language or you have the thought of a long-term strategy makes me think that you were a lot more cognizant of the business aspects of creativity.
Yeah, I probably was, because I was around a lot of musicians, and I had friends who were like a couple friends, or quite a few actually, who were quite good. But then I'd see that they'd like pursue the wrong avenue sometimes, like maybe put all their eggs in one basket, or they would like, I got to record this record and put it out because these are great songs. And then they would make a really bad record. It was like, I saw that happen quite a few times.
Like they rushed it?
Well, they just worked with people who didn't know what they were doing,
Ah.
And so it would just like sound not great, and then you'd hear it and you'd be like, oh, you did that, Or just like, because a lot of that stuff was like immediate gratification. I saw that happen a lot, like playing lots and lots of gigs at the same shitty bars over and over again, which there's some value in that. Like, I'm not a snob about that either. Like, I think it's good to play bars, and whatever gigs you want to play, you should play them, but if you feel like that's what you should do. But I don't know, I was like maybe a little bit more deliberate in some of that stuff than I realized at the time, maybe, or looking back on it, maybe trying to like hold out and do something that I could be proud of in the long term and not just immediately hate. I mean, that said, like I don't think I've ever made like a perfect record, and every single record I've ever made, including my latest one, like I'll hear it and I don't necessarily want to listen to it because I just hear flaws,
Oh, I get
And
that.
so, it's not necessarily like everything's hunky dory all the time, but yeah, at the same time, I think maybe I had a little bit more of a methodology going on there than I probably realized.
Yeah. I think I've been obsessed with not necessarily career longevity, but I mean, sure, because this is now how I make a living, but creative longevity. I was obsessed with this when I was younger. I would see comedians or actors who I loved and idolized doing like the worst shit. And I was like, what happened? Like, what happened? I don't mean like they got worse, but like, what are the choices necessarily they made where now they have to do X, or they're so disconnected from the world that the things that they think are funny don't connect with a human being anymore because they, like, I don't know, live in Brentwood in a gated community, and
right, they're like culturally isolated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I still am to a degree obsessed with that, making sure that I live a life that is, again, I partly why I asked about groundedness, and I'll get back to this in a little bit. But like, to become unmoored from the world means that the art you make, it no longer has any kind of like oomph to it. And I was obsessed. I still am. I'm obsessed with like making sure that I don't do that. Even though I make lots of weird shit too. But like, anyway, I at least hope the weird shit has a kernel of like the world in it.
Yeah, I think people can become disconnected from whatever cultural scene that they were a part of, and that's its own problem, which sometimes can be good for people to sort of, I think especially in terms of like a local scene sometimes where those things can like suck you in, and some people become too much. They depend on that, and that becomes everything, and then they don't have other stuff. But I also think like for me, it's not so much about that, like the scene or even a genre or anything. It's more kind of like returning to the feeling that you have when you're doing something that you like. And if you can kind of trust that sort of deep intuitive thing, it's not going to like fail you if it feels right. And that's a hard thing to express because I think some people get away from that because you don't really you don't know what the magic is or whatever because there's not really a name for it. And if there was, you'd be able to tap into it, So whatever that inspired thing is that you feel, if you can access that somehow, that's kind of the key, I think.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of stuff out there that will disguise itself as that,
Yes.
A lot of trickery. Especially when you become more successful, you have access to like better gear and technology and recording stuff. And you're like, oh my God, this beautiful $40,000 microphone sounds amazing. And it's like, well, everything sounds amazing on that microphone, but maybe that's not a very good song you're singing after all, or whatever, that there's that problem, and I think that happens to a lot of the people like you're talking about.
Yeah. So to go back to this idea of groundedness, I think the reason why I started out with that, besides just the thinking about America and thinking about kind of the history and time and all of this kind of stuff that I think I was thinking of when I was reading this interview with you yesterday. When you play a traditional form of music, or when that's kind of at the base of the music you make, that's why I asked the grounded part. I'm like, do you feel this country when you play music? Does that make sense at all? Like, is that like a deep part of you, or is it just that I like this music? It just so happens to be, if I grew up in England, I would be playing, folk music or whatever. Right. Does that make sense as a question?
I think so. I think if I grew up in England, I might be more interested in English folk music. I do like English folk music as it is,
sure,
but kind of by proxy of its connection to American folk music. Well, I'm grounded in my time and place, I think, and my background. So I had a lot of deep impressions. I was witness to a lot of stuff as a child, culturally, because my parents were both involved in folklore, and they're both artists. And so I grew up around a lot of artists, and that was inspiring enough, all of that throughout my whole childhood, to make me want to be an artist, to be creative. I didn't really think I had much choice otherwise. Now, how I made my living was another topic. The goal, I guess, was to eventually, like, if you could, that'd be the best scenario, but I was going to be interested in music no matter what, because I was around so much great music as a kid, and it was so inspiring. And so that was enough to propel me through life, really. It's been great companion music,
Yeah.
So I'm grounded in that way, I guess. I think that's the, I don't know, but because I had this background, and people didn't get it music through different ways and different avenues. And some people asked me if I ever like rebelled against my parents, and I didn't have that because I felt like my parents were rebellious themselves. For one thing, they were kind of went against the grain of what was mainstream around me when I was growing up. They were different from my friends' parents in a lot of ways.
So I think this is maybe where I find there to be something interesting here, in that I think in this interview you said, you called your parents outsiders, right? At the same time, you are working in this traditional form of music, of American music specifically, right? And I think there's something interesting there. There's some interesting tension, and maybe I'm just placing this on you and you're just like, it's nothing. But like, is there like, am I reading something into it, or do you feel that that's there?
You mean like being interested in that as opposed to being like a free jazz artist or like within the bounds of traditional music, you mean?
Yeah, I guess I just mean that like at the same time there is this like outsider feeling, and maybe that is the core of like what's good about America, is this like feeling the like right now we live in this world where kind of like that individuality has metastasized into something bad, where there's no sense of collective good or no sense of community, or very little sense of community. But that at the core of what made this country, or at least the mythology of this country, good, is the sense of like of individuality, of being an iconoclast, of pushing against the, again, the mythology of the country is we fought against the king, right? The tyranny, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we stood outside that, even though if that's not the reality necessarily. At the same, so like maybe I am reading something into this that, or maybe I'm not articulating this in any way that anyone can grapple with. But like this idea of there being of you growing up thinking your parents are outsiders, wanting to do something creative in a world now in the 20th, 21st century that is very corporatized. At the same way, working in a traditional American art form.
Right. No, I understand that tension and what you're talking about. I think I realized when I was a kid that I had this sort of like opportunity before me because I was around people who were really knowledgeable about traditional music. And I also, at a certain point, I think, especially when I was like in high school, when you start really forming some of your taste about all this, like middle school, high school age, and I think around puberty, there's like a thing that happens if you're interested in music where things begin to take like a more serious turn. Like you're interested in that stuff as a kid and it's fun or whatever, but then like you really start learning how to play guitar and you realize that, I mean, I say this is my experience, was that it became apparent that this was a much deeper brew than anything else that I knew about, at least. I mean, for some people that's abstract expressionism or it's free jazz or whatever, and I was not deeply into that, or whatever, it's poetry. But for me, it was traditional music. It was as interesting or more interesting than anything else, and it reflected all the problems and vagaries of human existence and expression, And yes, it became with all these problems like preconceived notions of authenticity or all that sort of stuff. But that was also part of the brew that was really interesting to me. All that discussion about insider, outsider, that became part of the fabric of it for me. That was interesting.
Yeah.
And all the people who were documentarians were talking about all that stuff all the time. They weren't ignorant to it. Alan Lomax was constantly kind of grappling with that stuff.
Right.
Art Rosenbaum, who was my parents' good friend, and he was a mentor to me in many ways, he was always talking about those things. It was part of the dialogue. So that became a great resource to me, So I wanted to think about that stuff all the time. And I probably made the mistake of thinking that I was going into that as an academic for a minute there when I was in college. Like I thought I was going to pursue it in writing, and I realized that that was not my avenue. It was useful to me in some ways to be in that kind of like classroom setting and to talk with people who have these sorts of discussions, I guess. But I realized that that wasn't my the thing that I was really strong at was more playing music and trying to get at it through that in some kind of way.
Yeah. Did you dislike the structures of academia?
I liked the teachers and I liked the class. I liked talking. There were certain parts about writing that I liked, but not all of it. I kind of felt insecure about my writing,
Oh,
um, and because there were some people who were just so good at it,
uh huh.
and I never felt like I could articulate myself in that kind of way.
I get that.
But the main thing I realized too is like, everybody in academia that I know complains about this or they're constantly talking about it. It's just how academia is very networky and competitive. And uh, God, not that the music business isn't, but I felt like I could manage that a little bit more in my own terms.
Jake, I used to be an academic. And the thing is, I was in philosophy. I did not love philosophy enough to put up with that bullshit. Whereas I
Yeah.
do love TV and comedy enough to put up with that.
Yeah, it's a different set of rules or something. I'm not really sure, but there's a lot of horseshit every direction. But something about the music world, I could kind of navigate some of that stuff a little easier. Maybe probably because I felt a little more secure. I
Hmm.
think grad school brings out insecurities in you unless. I noticed that a lot of people who are really good at it were like the children of academics, or they had like been wanting to be academics for a long time or
Yeah.
something and felt very secure about it. And I just didn't. There were parts of it that I really liked and felt secure about, but then other parts where it was just like, oh God, what is this?
Yeah. I want to go back for a second though, because you were saying that as a teenager, it started to become more meaningful to you. And I'm kind of curious about what that process was. Was it just started to feel more fulfilling, or was it a cognizant thing? Like, were you thinking through certain things and then it started to become more meaningful to you?
Well, I'll say this. I think something occurred to me pretty early on when I was a teenager, which is that, how do I explain this? I had the benefit of being around like a lot of living people who are playing traditional music, which is a different set of resources from somebody who just knows this music through the discography.
Right.
Now, I knew both of those, so I had that privilege. So at the same time that I was like learning about pre-war 78s and stuff like that, and like the Harry Smith anthology, I was already around some of that music, a good bit of it. So a lot of people that I knew, they're like my age or maybe a little older than me, knew it both. Some people had to pursue that later, but their first. And this is when I say this, it sounds like I'm like authenticating myself in this way. I'm not trying to imply that I'm just like, I'm not trying to say that like it's more genuine or something, because actually, like the way that I know about traditional music is through my parents who were part of the world of documentary stuff. Like, so it's not like I'm trying to claim I grew up in some mountain holler and like, that's not like
Right.
the avenue that I'm like. I think of myself through the sort of world of folklore and documentation as how I get to traditional music.
You're not
But
wearing like a disguise like JD Vance.
well,
Right.
that's the thing
what I'm
is that
saying.
like I noticed that people who were learning about it from records first were more prone to that kind of behavior where it was about dressing up in a costume. Now, I don't really judge that because I do think so much about music is performative and it is about a shtick. And uh, also, there are many, many levels of like recreation and um, that's a complicated thing. Like everybody has a costume to a degree, including me. Um, So I'm not trying to claim that I'm free of all that because I think
Sure.
it's all a kind of a mixed bag, and we all have our own problems with the way that we perceive culture, I guess. But anyway, I think I realized early on as a teenager, I think around the time I was like 14, 15, somewhere in there, and started really wanting to pursue playing guitar and learning like traditional material and old songs. And I think I realized that there was room enough in all this stuff to be creative, that I didn't have to subscribe to any form of authenticity. That was kind of missing the point. It seemed irrelevant to me. It was like I noticed that some people really went hard in that direction, and it wasn't necessarily like getting at the thing to me. Like um you could explore all this stuff on your own kind of terms that were creative.
Yeah.
Um, at the same time, I did think that it wasn't just like a free for all because I do feel like there are certain like rules or idioms in traditional music that are worth tracking and like paying attention to, and serious like documentation of that stuff is important. I have immense respect for people who learn fiddle tune note for note and want to play it the exact same way as their mentor. I've been one of those people, because I did that for a while. And then I decided, I mean, it wasn't a decision. I just couldn't help but like pursue my own voice within that thing because to not pursue it felt disingenuous.
Uh-huh. I think the difference is you growing up, it's a vibrant part of your life. People are playing this music around you, and it's not a dead document. You're not listening to a Victrola record or something like that and being like, interesting, like an academic, or like me, like, like whatever. I encountered John Fahey albums in college
Hmm.
and I love it, but it's not like I didn't grow up with it. It wasn't like a deep part of my life. I think if I would start learning how to play guitar like that, I don't think, I think the authenticity is not about whether you put on this costume, but rather how close the costume is to who you are as a person. And with you growing up in a certain way, it's just like putting on any pair of clothes. Whereas if I were to put it on, it would be like me. This is such a shitty metaphor, but it would be like me putting on a Halloween costume, if that makes any sense. If I were to start learning how to play like finger pick like John Fahey or something like that, or does that make any sense at all?
I think so. I mean, I think, again, for me, I want to reiterate that it's not like there is a leap there that I take, in playing some of this music. Because I didn't grow up in like a musical tradition in the way that some people did. Like it's not like I'm singing ballads that my grandmother sang. There is a distance between me and the communities that created this music. And so I need to be explicit about that. I come to it through sort of a cultural movement of people who are documenting this stuff, and my parents were those people, and their friends were those people. George Mitchell was a guy who made all these blues recordings, and I grew up around him, and he would give me tapes and stuff to listen to. Art Rosenbaum was another person. He was an incredible musician and just encyclopedic knowledge of all things traditional music, not just American music, but knew a ton about British balladry and sea shanties and wrote about religious music, and just a really abnormally knowledgeable person about all that stuff. And he was certainly a constant sort of inspiration because I would get together with him as a kid and when I was a teenager and until a few years ago when he died, I'd play music and stuff and learn songs from him and learn about things sort of through him. He would tell me about books and records. But there is, I mean, at the same time too, I should be clear that like when I was growing up and learning about all this music, I was also listening to like Nirvana and the Beastie Boys, and
Sure.
whatever else was on the radio or MTV in the 90s. and I liked all that stuff, but it
Sure.
wasn't, most of it wasn't, I didn't take it that seriously compared to traditional music because I felt like it was a more intense form or something. And maybe that's tied into some sort of like notions of authenticity that are a little bit squirrely, you know. There could be some weird stuff there that I should probably pick apart. But at the same time, I don't know. I was led by my interests, and some of that's romantic, and I don't. That's okay, I think.
I mean, how did your parents become interested in being? Let's see here. Your dad was a folklorist. Your mom was a teacher, correct?
Hmm.
You know, how did they become interested in this? How do they find their own life paths?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think my dad grew up in kind of like working class Alabama, and I think he had maybe a high school teacher who was interested in these things and then sort of pursued it as a young person interested in art. But neither one of them lived outside of the region ever. Like my mom went to college in Athens and then Atlanta, but none of them lived on like New York or anything like that, and or like in a big urban folk revival scene. They were each sort of interested in their own region, and I think my dad got into it through, well, they both did through like the material culture world more than music. Really, they were both part of like interested in crafts, and so
Uh huh.
my mom grew up in a family that had a lot of uh, seamstresses and quilters in her family, and she was interested in that. I think she also might have had a high school teacher who talked about ballads and stuff like that. That's kind of worth thinking about. I think there was probably more popular interest in folk culture some than we give credit to at a certain era. You know, I don't know.
This is the 1960s.
Yeah, and probably an extension of English class in some ways. You know, I think. Well, anyway, my mom was a student in college of this guy named John Burrison, who's one of the real material culture folklorists. But I mean, he's written extensively about pottery and crafts. He wrote the book on Georgia pottery. But he would have class and he would have like Georgia Sea Island singers and Bessie Jones come to class. And my mom was a student, you know, and they'd perform in the classroom at Georgia State,
Uh huh.
or bring in like Lanier Metters, the Metters family, you know, seventh generation North Georgia potter to talk about pottery and throw pots in class, you know. So she was like a witness to that, but she was also from South Georgia and grew up sort of seeing these sort of things in rural life and was interested in that. And it was, you know, in the 60s, and it was part of like people were interested in sort of returning to some of that stuff. There was a revival going on and interest in crafts and handmade things. And then my dad was they met sort of through him. And yeah, they were both part of that world.
Yeah. Okay. So there's another interesting tension here in the sense that it is both something that is meaningful to you or to your parents, right? But it is also you're also apart from it in a way, like an academic sense where you are outside of it looking in, but also you are in it, right?
Hmm.
And there's that tension there. I talk about tensions a lot because I think this is where like the most interesting creative stuff happens within the tension between different whatevers in the middle of contradictions. I think it happened. I mean, let's just say this. I don't want to say that hard, like it's a hard and fast rule. Interesting creative things can happen within contradictions. Also, messes can happen, but
Yeah. Or sometimes the interesting things are messy, you
yeah,
know.
true.
Um, I think they often are. But like one thing that I think about a lot is like because I go around and I play these traditional songs or whatever, and I have this bio that people can read quickly, and you know, and sometimes I'll have people will comment, you know, like it's so great that you're carrying on this legacy or whatever. And I don't see that as what I'm doing.
Hmm.
I think what I'm doing is very different from somebody who's like um, carrying on their family legacy. Now, in a way, I am in that my parents were interested in this stuff and they're artists. My dad's a painter and my mom's a quilter, so I'm part of that legacy. But it's not the legacy of like preservation of these old songs,
Right.
which I think is the pretense. And I don't knock. I think there are people who function in that way, and I think that's great. But it's not necessarily like the thing that I set out to do is preserve. I don't think of myself as like an archival resource or anything like that.
Yeah.
But there are some musicians who do that, and I think that's great and a good thing to do. But it's funny because I think a lot of the people who might see me that way, either they don't know much about me or they don't usually, and then or they're from outside of like the folk thing, so they sort of see me as some sort of authentic like touchstone to that world or something, or access point, and I'm not
Mm.
really that.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, I was a kid who was around like rural blues musicians, and I learned from some of those people songs, but I don't think of myself as this like inheritor of those traditions. I was sort of tracking those things on my own terms, and then also not necessarily following up on all of that, like in a way that was all that methodical. Like I had my own tastes and biases about that stuff. I was around plenty of fiddlers growing up, and I never learned how to play the fiddle, which I kind of regret, honestly. I could have, if I wanted to be that, I would have pursued it in a much more different way.
Right. But I think again, here's this other thing. You are kind of and you're kind of not. And in making it your own, that is kind of being part of the tradition because everyone, the kind of cold preservation of old art is good in a museum like setting. But in the real world, right? It's not like whoever was making music in whatever, 1865. It's not like they were just taking whatever was happening in 1845 and just doing it exactly. They were doing their own thing with it too. So in the sense of being part of that tradition and in making it your own, you are part of the tradition in the same way that you're also not by making it your own, if that makes sense. Because again, you have the kind of like museum academic version, and then you have the real life vibrant version that's kind of hitting up against each other.
Yes, and then the closer you look at these so-called like academic versions, they're actually not all that like everybody's kind of being expressive on some level,
Right.
when it comes to music, and even like the most sort of historically faithful reenactment of certain types of music is gonna sound different than the source it's trying to be or trying to recreate, just because it's someone else doing it, you're always going to sound like yourself no matter how hard you try to sound like someone else. And
Right.
so I think probably that's one of the things that I realized early on as well, and so I don't know. Yeah. I mean, yes. And then the closer you look at some traditions, you're like, oh, community tradition. This community had this music tradition. And then you start looking at all the players who were a part of it. And you're like, well, that guy wasn't actually from that community. He was
Uh-huh.
from this other community. And he came in and kind of changed everything. And then so people are interpreting him and play him like him, but actually he wasn't from there. But now it's called this, and people call it that community, but it's actually really informed by this other thing, And that happens over and over again when you start looking into these folk traditions.
Yeah. I mean, we're right at the end. There's two questions I have left. I'll start with this one. You grew up in Columbus, Georgia, correct?
Hmm.
What was that like? This is the 80s into the 90s in Georgia. What was the atmosphere?
The atmosphere, well, Columbus is interesting because it's like a medium-sized industrial city where the industry had mostly died.
Mm.
So it was a textile town, and by the time I was a kid, there were only a few of the cotton mills running, and that was slowly being replaced by other industry. But I think in the 80s, it was kind of depressed in some ways. But interestingly, because it's like an old industrial town, and because the population there's demographically, it might be like 60 or close to, I'm not sure what the breakdown is, but like a pretty significant black middle class. So it's actually like, even though it's the middle of the deep south, it's in that sort of fall line belt where a lot of those counties are blue. So politically, it was fairly liberal in terms of numbers. And what was it like? Well, I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, I
I mean,
had,
did you have like a typical kind of childhood? Because you also your parents are, you're playing music. You're part of this. People are coming in, and I mean, I'm making this up as I'm like, I guess, teaching your parents. You're going places to with your dad. I mean, what was
yeah, we had a
going
lot of
on?
road trips, and sometimes that was within the region, just like day trips or whatever. My dad would be going to interview somebody or to track down some basket maker because he wanted a piece. He worked for the museum, the Columbus Museum, so it's the art museum. But then through that, he was doing a lot of folklore stuff. And then, um, so yeah, he would be interviewing people. A lot of times I was, riding shotgun and carrying a cassette tape recorder, and I sat through, I don't know how many interviews. And he would have a camera or a video camera sometimes. But then also like family trips we would go to Florida, and sometimes that would lead to that would lead to folklore.
In what way?
Like, well, my parents are just interested in history and stuff, so we'd always be stopping at some cemetery or some old church, and my dad would see something like, oh, that person is selling flowers made out of corn shucks or something. And then we'd drive down to somebody's house and we'd wind up, he would interview this person or whatever. So that would, my parents were both very curious people. So that was like my childhood for me and my sister. It was just like constantly doing that kind of thing.
Did you like that, or were you just like, can we just go to the water slide park?
No, we liked it. Sometimes it was like a thing we gave them hell about, just depending on what it was. But no, we liked it. And my sister, my sister Coulter she can talk about all this stuff, probably more eloquently than I can, but she does the same thing that I do, but visually. She's a visual artist. So she was witness to all this stuff too.
When you go to some, like, your dad sees someone, who's like, oh, we should interview them, and then you go to their house or whatever. Is that I guess I was about to say weird. It's not really the word I want, but it feels, I guess, weird. I'll just say weird and then interpret that as it is. Like, did you, like, when you were a kid, are you like, why are we doing this?
No, because the process was not the way my dad always worked with that stuff was very natural and very friendly. And if you ever got the vibe that somebody wasn't digging you being around, he would politely sort of be like, "All right, we'll leave you alone."
That's what I was like. I
But
think
there was sort of just like, it didn't feel real invasive. There was like a lot of like curiosity and enthusiasm about what somebody's doing. And if somebody's passionate about what they're doing, they like for you to come and check it out. So I mean, and also some people felt like they had been under documented. They're like, I'm a good damn fiddler. Somebody should record me. That happened quite a bit. And if you play something back for somebody and they can hear that sounds good. But also in some cases, like it would be like folk festivals and stuff that my dad was involved in, and so they would have an opportunity to present their craft. They could sell their pottery or whatever, or they'd have a slot on the stage where they could play with their old time band or or play blues harmonica or whatever it was, you know. So some people are very receptive to that kind of thing. It just depends on the situation and if they've been like um, done wrong by some documentarian or something. Sometimes that sort of thing has happened, you know. But most of the time, the vast majority of the time, people are quite friendly, and it always felt really interesting. And then the, you know, through like talking to people in conversation, the story gets pretty deep, you know. So that would be, but a lot of times it wasn't. It would be like, all right, somebody's got some quilts hanging up on the clothesline, and just go talk to them. These are great, and it wouldn't be necessarily some deep, you know, wouldn't be there for hours or whatever. It was more like,
Right.
hey. But in other cases, it would turn into a relationship for many years, you know, and a sort of deeper story there.
So I can kind of see how it gets in your bones then, right? From doing this all the time, going with your parents, or even like, you know, on a vacation, this happens.
Yeah, well, it was fun, you know. I mean, it was more fun than most of the stuff that was called fun, you know.
Right. Yeah.
But also, you know, I think I was the youngest kid, so everybody was older than me, you know. So I never had that thing about people being old or whatever. I never related any of that when people talk about like, oh, you got to be around the adults or whatever. Well, everybody's the adults when I was growing up. I never stigmatize age in that kind of way. And so it never bothered me being around people like telling stories or a room full. I always loved that, like hearing older folks in a room. Like, you know, I remember being a kid and like playing on the floor at my grandmother's house, and she and my aunts and uncles would all be telling stories, and that was magical, you know.
That's the thing. And to just go back to the very beginning, that's the thing where when I talk about being grounded, you know, when I hear stuff like that or I'm part of that, when people are telling me these stories, it makes me feel part of history in a way that when I just think about history, I get that panic of time and death and everything. But then when I hear someone tell a story and I'm present in that, it makes me feel part of it in a way, and like a way of being present in history and feeling as I'm a participant in it, as opposed to standing apart from it. Does that make any sense at all? I think that's what I was trying to articulate with this idea of groundedness earlier.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I forgot what I was going to say.
Yeah, but that's I think the, like, you saying that made me think of like hearing like my grandmother or my parents or you know, older aunts and uncles telling stories. And
yeah, well, I guess what I was going to say is you've had that feeling before that I'm talking about.
Yes,
you know,
exactly.
And that, I'm guessing that made you into somebody who interviews people.
Maybe. I mean, this is just a podcast happened to be a thing when I started doing comedy. Like, it was in burgeoning. And so, and I like this. This is enjoyable to find these things out about people, or to discover these things about people. But I don't know if podcasts had maybe not, maybe if it had been like 5 years into it and it had just been like a norm, like I might have rebelled against it. Like, I'm not doing that.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Last question.
Yeah.
Because this is something I've like had in the back of my head since you said, I forget the exact wording, but you said something like, you know, growing up with your parents, I forget the exact word. It was like good, moral, noble. I forget the exact thing, but it just like sparked something in my head. And I was just curious about, like, what did you mean by that? If you remember again, I don't think I'm using the correct word that you use, but like decent parents. It seems like you said you were like, early on when we were talking, and I was curious like what you meant by that.
Oh, I just meant that I was like I was like in a loving environment when I was a kid, I guess was what I meant.
Yeah. How did that express itself? Like, what did that mean?
Well, one thing that my sister and I talk about sometimes is that, you know, like because we are both like creative and or interested in creativity and like passionate about the stuff we pursue creatively. Sometimes people are like, what did your parents do to make you that or whatever? And it was like, well, we were just around it, like it wasn't like we really had a choice, but we also both liked it. And I think we liked it because my parents never tried to force us into any of this stuff. Like I was never told I needed to be a musician. And my sister, I know she was never told she had to be an artist. It was just like, do you want to be in on this thing? That's fine. Like you're just around it. And then it's
Yeah.
like, why not? Look at this. This is like, it was positive encouragement, but it wasn't like ever shoved down our throat. There was never any pretense about what I needed to be. And so I think that was admirable.
Yeah. Did they give you general freedom to kind of discover who you were as a person?
Yes.
Period.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think my parents were they're free thinkers, I think they're from like maybe a generation of like people who were like, well, they were from like the 50. My dad's, how old is he now? 82. I think they're from this generation of like free thinking, but also like kind of satirical and Mad Magazine. And I think about, you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah,
I think
I
there
do.
was a little bit of like questioning the man, like, yeah, like anti-authoritarian, and certainly growing up in the Deep South, there was plenty to be anti-authoritarian about. I think they grew up in a segregated world and saw the hypocrisy and all that stuff as white people growing up in the Deep South, and were witness to a lot of that. And so um, I know that informed them.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. Jake, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It was an absolute delight to talk to you. I love your music. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, really nice talking to you.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh.